So I am T.M. Lemos, professor of Hebrew Bible here at Huron University College and an affiliate of the Center for Transitional Justice and Post-Conflict Reconstruction at the University of Western Ontario. The occasion for this panel is the imminent publication of the 3-volume Cambridge World History of Genocide. I'm a co-editor of Volume 1, which covers genocide in prehistory, antiquity, and the medieval world. I'm grateful to the panelists gathered here today who will use the publication of these volumes as a springboard for discussing major issues in the history of the field of genocide studies, as well as some of the most pressing topics in the field today and future directions for the study of genocide. Our first panelist is Doris Bergen, the Chancellor Rose and Ray Wolfe Chair in Holocaust Studies at the University of Toronto. Doris is a member of the Academic Advisory Committee of the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and author of several books, including Twisted Cross, The German Christian Movement in the Third Reich. Her graduate assistant, Vanessa Sebastian, was also joining us today. We have a panelist who I think may be joining us late, Victoria Tin-Bor, who is associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame and a faculty fellow of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies and the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies. She's the author of War and State Formation in Ancient China and Early Modern Europe, and has also published widely on Hong Kong politics in newspapers throughout the world, and spoken recently on the Uyghur crisis. Ben Kiernan, who is the general editor of the Cambridge World History of Genocide volumes. Ben is the A. Whitney Griswold Professor Emeritus of History at Yale University, and was the founding director of both the Cambodian Genocide Program and the Genocide Studies Program at Yale. He's the author of the landmark book, Blood and Soil, A World History of Genocide and Extermination from Sparta to Darfur, among other works. Lindsay Scorgie is Associate Professor of Political Science at Huron University College. A specialist in Central Africa, Lindsay is the author of Conflict at the Edge of the African State, the ADF rebel group in the Congo-Uganda borderland. She's interested in the politics of memory regarding the Rwandan genocide and runs an annual experiential learning trip to Rwanda for undergraduates. Andrew Woolford is Professor of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Manitoba. Andrew is a former president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. He has published widely on the Indigenous history of Canada with his books including This Benevolent Experiment, Indigenous Boarding Schools, Genocide and Redress in North America. I'm very grateful to all of the panelists for joining us today for what I hope will be a very fruitful discussion, and also grateful to the participants who are viewing this webinar. Let me start with Ben. You've published so widely in genocide studies. Why did you decide to take on the Cambridge World History of Genocide project? What did you hope to achieve with it?
Well, I thought that it would be a good idea to try to look back through history over thousands of years and try to capture some of the themes of the many genocides that have taken place from prehistory to the present. Some of the themes that we cover in these 3 volumes include race and gender and climate change and the role of the state and religion, famine, and so on. We have special chapters devoted to them in the first volume of the 3. And these themes of genocide can be sorted into ideological themes or political administrative themes, socioeconomic themes, and environmental themes. But there's also another category that are the motivations of human decision-making, and they can be contrasted with more long-term themes, structural themes. So we need to determine what are the real causes of genocide by looking at the different themes. In volume 2, for instance, we have a thematic chapter that starts off after the introduction on by Ned Blackhawk, a Native American historian, on dispossession and settler colonialism, a thematic chapter to start volume 2. And in volume 3, a thematic chapter on humanitarianism, racism, and anti-Semitism, looking at the 20th century, and another thematic chapter on war and genocide in the 20th century. These are broad themes, and they're complemented by specific chapters, and that's another reason for doing a long survey with 3 volumes with individual chapters on specific cases by experts on those cases. And so we have about 80 chapters altogether, and excluding the thematic chapters, specific case studies by people who really know those specific events in history. And one of the advantages, of course, is that we have, I think, uncovered some little known or lesser known cases of genocide. We also uncovered several cases that didn't turn out to be genocides, that where the author in this case thought that there wasn't enough evidence, or perhaps even no contemporaneous local evidence for genocide taking place. So I think we've made a contribution there, looking closely at specific cases in the light of larger themes, and distinguishing the long-term causes of genocide from the human decision-making or the immediate factors that lead to individuals setting genocides in motion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ben. I think that's a helpful answer. Turning now to the origins of this field, genocide studies is a field with rather unique origins, I would say. Obviously, it was the Holocaust that spurred the development of this field, and the study of the Holocaust has remained central to genocide studies. But in the decades since the field's inception, scholars came to occupy themselves with the analysis of a wide set of genocides, and a comparative approach became commonplace. Doris, could you reflect on these shifts for a moment?
Thank you so much, Tracy, for inviting me here. And I want to talk about, I think, really 3 patterns that are related to what you described as the shifts. The first is, I guess you could say, the kind of standard narrative, what you implied, that, well, you have Holocaust studies and that it becomes more kind of diversified or open over time. And I think this is a narrative that people, I would say in my field, Holocaust studies, like to tell ourselves. You know, I just went to a big Holocaust conference in Ottawa, and there was that sort of sense of, oh, you know, we're opening up the field. But that's only one of the things I think going on. Another, I guess, development that I think you could see right now is a more back and forth. I think you could say in some ways, actually, the fields are more separate than they've ever been. If you look at institutionalization, if you look at endowed chairs, if you look at grant agencies, professional conferences and organizations, they're actually quite divergent. So I think the narrative of progress and opening up, academics, we love that, right? Because we got to feel like our work is like better than those, you know, people that we've, you know, left behind. But it's not always the case. And I think there's actually lots of evidence that has to do with, you could say, the political stakes of this field in so many different places. In Israel, obviously, but also in Canada, also in Poland and Hungary. Like the question of the relationship between the Holocaust and other genocides, it has huge political stakes. So yeah, I don't think it's like a one-way street. Then the third pattern I want to point to, which I think is the most interesting, is that actually it's not so clear that the Holocaust came first and other genocides later, that these studies have always been deeply, deeply entangled. And to just give a few examples of what I mean, I mean, the most obvious, you think about Raphael Lemkin, coined the term genocide during World War II. He was himself Jewish. He was interested, obviously, in the fate and destruction of his own family and community. He was deeply interested in the Armenian genocide. He was very interested in genocide of indigenous peoples in Tasmania. Like, for him, the concept was from the beginning entangled. Also interesting is looking at Jewish sources from in the time of the Holocaust, is how often Jews themselves compared their situation to what they viewed or knew about the victims of colonialism. People calling themselves, we are the Indians, we are the Black slaves. So like that sense of being part of a shared story, it's like already there. After the war, you have the first like survivor scholars, people like Leon Polyakov. They consciously connected the destruction of Jews with other histories of suffering in order to try to get people to listen, to connect with others. Also, from the other side, from non-Jews, there's an intense interest already during the time of the war that what's happening to Jews in Europe or what's happening to people with disabilities is related to us. Edward Kissey has a fantastic new book, The Holocaust and Africans, and he talks about like African responses in the time, how closely people monitored and followed those events, connected them to their own lives. One of our PhD students, Camilla Collins-Oraza, has worked on Caribbean intellectuals and their responses to the Holocaust. People like Aimé Césaire, right? Writing like this amazing poem, like, when a Black man is lynched, we know Hitler is not dead. So those entanglements, there's tons of people, you can see them. And then one last point, even when the Holocaust discourse really began to take off in the United States in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the vocabulary of discussions of African-American history, the history of slavery, and also civil rights movement, these categories shaped discussions of the Holocaust. Think about vocabulary like slavery, passing, even race, the idea of social death, straight from Orlando Patterson. So there's actually a really long history of connection, but it's not the history that's on the surface, you know what I mean? And many of those links have been forgotten and neglected.
Wow, that's a really fascinating answer. Thank you for that. So as a follow-up to that, do you think because of these links and these entanglements that the field has moved past debates over the Holocaust uniqueness, or is that still an important area of discussion in the field?
This is such an important question. And I have to say, a person hates to be wrong about stuff when you're a scholar, but I wrote an article some years ago where I said, like, why are we still flogging that dead horse of uniqueness? We've so moved past that, but actually it's not the case. I think that topic is very, very live. And as I mentioned, I think it has to do with the stakes, you know, that are involved in precisely maintaining that claim about uniqueness. But the interesting thing is the topic is alive, but the debate around it continues. And the two things are so tightly entangled. I'll just give you one example. Maybe some of you remember about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talked about concentration camps on the United States southern border, right? And there was a, you know, big hullabaloo and people like, you can't say concentration camps. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which I've been associated with for years, somebody issued a statement and they're like, we absolutely say you cannot make comparisons, right? The Holocaust Memorial Museum has an entire branch, the Committee on Conscience, which is devoted to making comparisons, to building the lessons of the Holocaust, to talking about commonalities. At the very same time that one of their offices put out the statement, no comparisons, they were preparing a huge and amazing exhibit on Rohingya genocide. So like, this is how the uniqueness discussion and the counter are completely like wrapped up in each other, and they do definitely both continue.
It's really fascinating. I mean, I sort of smiled when you made the comment about the Holocaust Museum, because I've seen that Rohingya exhibit. I saw it in May. So it's really interesting that you would have that statement be made, even as we see that exhibit right there in the Holocaust Museum. That's really fascinating. Well, thank you for those answers. What questions in Holocaust studies seem the most pivotal to you today? And if any other panelists want to jump in on this, what questions about Holocaust studies seem pivotal, and, how do we address this question in work on the Holocaust or in our work on other genocides, of how the Holocaust relates to other genocides?
I mean, I think a couple of different strands are really important right now. One for sure is about gender and sexuality. So much interesting cutting edge work being done, not only about sexual violence, but about queer desire in the Holocaust. The scholar Anna Haikova, who's worked on that. These issues are, I think, really important and have opened tons of new avenues. Another area, okay, in my mind, it should be more pivotal than it is about the murder of people with disabilities. This is a subject that has been both known about, but niche, not well integrated. And actually, I think that sadly remains to be true. But some people are doing fantastic, fantastic work trying to recover, especially some testimonies and individual accounts, to really restore a history to people who have just been deemed not fitting witnesses of their own history. I think the scholarship on the Roma and Sinti during the Holocaust has get some really, really important recent work, like people like Fulha Barhash and others. And again, that work I think is being better integrated. And of course, there's tons of really interesting work on Jewish sources that have also been neglected. People think we know everything. It's so not true. Yiddish sources, diaries, sources from ghettos, like materials that have just been forgotten, neglected, and trying to get to an everyday history. I feel like these are some of the areas that are really exciting right now.
Could I add something on this, on the
Please.
importance of Holocaust history and historiography and other work on Holocaust sociology and so on? It's very important for genocide studies, whether or not the Holocaust is considered unique or not. Other words that have been used, unprecedented but not unique is an expression that Yehuda Bauer, the Holocaust historian, has used to describe the Holocaust, that it was unprecedented, but since then, he's implying there have been similar cases that make the Holocaust not unique, but it was unprecedented at the time. Another term that's been used is the most extreme genocide, although not unique as applied to the Holocaust. I think the uniqueness debate has influenced the study of other genocides in a positive way. It's caused a lot of useful thinking and analysis of other genocides, but the superb scholarship that's been done on the Holocaust itself, even without discussing the uniqueness or otherwise of the Holocaust, has led the way in some ways to approaching other genocides. And I think that's starting, I hope, to come the other way as well, that the work that's been done on other genocides may, in the long run, improve the scholarship on the Holocaust. And I think, there's a possibility for the two fields to benefit from one another.
I think the second has already happened a lot. And again, I was just saying earlier to Andrew Woolford that his concept of settler colonial mesh has been so helpful to me in thinking about what I'm calling the genocidal culture of the German occupation regime in the Soviet territory during World War II. But even in the 90s, such a takeoff period in the Holocaust field, genocide in Rwanda, coverage of it, not only scholarship, but journalism on it, it transformed Holocaust field, drawing attention to intimate killing, to killing of neighbors against neighbors. That impulse came from, I think, seeing those events going on around us and revisiting the field. So like for sure, that cross-fertilization is really important.
Can I just jump in here as well? Just following up on something that Doris had said earlier about, you know, sort of the other victim groups. So for example, the Roma and Sinti. I do some work on, you know, politics of memory, and I think it's encouraging to see that we're starting to see a lot more scholarship on these other victim groups. But you know, one of the big issues that we're seeing is that, you know, a lot of these groups don't have the same presence of memorialization, and you know, first of all, they're just not, you know, not as well known, and you know, students aren't being educated about them as much in genocide studies. But you know, when you're looking at sort of the way that various genocides are memorialized, a lot of the time these groups are completely left out. And I think it's encouraging to start seeing that they are being included in a lot of the discussions about the Holocaust. And I think a lot has to do, you know, for a while, the Roma and Sinti, after, you know, the Holocaust, a lot of them were in areas where they, you know, their ability to voice what had happened was quite repressed. You know, in Eastern Europe, they're still very much, you know, discriminated against in a lot of countries. So they faced a lot of obstacles that other groups, you know, that Jewish groups often didn't after the Holocaust. So I think it's encouraging that we're starting to see more attention being paid to them as well.
And we can return later on to this question of memorialization. I'd like to talk about that, I think, a little bit later on if we have time. So questions for the whole panel. Questions of definition plague many fields of academia. Academics are sort of obsessed with definitional questions, I think. But, you know, having come into this field rather late, I mean, I was trained as a biblical scholar, and I've sort of, you know, made an unexpected kind of entree into this field. When I attended the International Association of Genocide Scholars Conference in Australia in 2017, I was really struck by how much definition issues were still being discussed. And so I wonder, should we all just give up on finding a perfect definition of genocide and concede that whatever definition we use in any particular work will have limitations? Or should we, as Dirk Moses and maybe some others have suggested, essentially give up on the term? You know, does the term obscure more than it illuminates, one might say? What do we think about this kind of intractable issues of definition when it comes to genocide?
I mean, I can just start off saying I think so far there isn't a viable alternative that we found. And, you know, I think that was a bit of a pushback to what Dirk Moses has written about, that, you know, there still isn't anything. A lot of scholars have come up with sort of variations on the term or other sort of terms to get at this, but nothing has really stuck. And I think there still is a lot of power to the word, and we see obviously it can be so politicized. Rwanda and Darfur are both examples of that sort of to the extreme. Yeah. But there's still a lot of power to the word, and I think we see that like with the Uyghurs right now in China, that, you know, as countries, including Canada's, you know, House of Commons, as we label it genocide, it does bring a different degree of attention to the issue. Whether we actually then act on it according to the UN Convention is something else. But.
If I may. Yeah, so
yes, go ahead, sure.
Thank you. Just want to add to that is that, especially with the situation of the Uyghurs, in a way that it is not that the definition itself is not clear, because essentially the Rome Statute specifies that, you know, if you target at a particular group and you cause damage to them through sterilization and taking the kids to boarding schools so that they lose the culture and stuff. I mean, all of these basically is what we're seeing. what we're missing is the political will. I was pretty surprised when the Museum of Genocide refrained from using the term genocide. They would just use crime against humanity. And then recently, the UN Human Rights High Commissioner Bachelet issued a report also refrained from using the word genocide, but again, using only crimes against humanity. It's the lack of political will. In a way that part of it is also because of the composition of the term, of the word size. So people keep thinking that, you know, if you don't kill people, then it doesn't really constitute genocide. And people often overlook that you don't really need to commit mass killing to have genocide.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point.
Yes, I'd like to come in there and support that point that Victoria's just made, because it's very clear legally that forcibly transferring children of the group to another group is under Article 2E of the Genocide Convention, an act of genocide if it's conducted with the intent to destroy the group as such. And so I think it's very clear that that form of genocide, even though not involving killing, is an act of genocide. And it's usually called cultural genocide, as you just outlined it, you know, taking children away from the group and bringing them up in another national culture. But it's one of the cases of cultural genocide which does fit the convention, the 1948 Genocide Convention's definition of genocide. And there are other forms of cultural genocide which don't involve forcible transfer of the children of the group to another group, which are not listed under the acts of genocide in the convention. But this is one that is, along with killing members of the group and subjecting them to living conditions calculated to cause harm or to cause death and so on. Forcible transfer of children of the group to another group is an act of genocide. And so Victoria's quite right. And I think she's also quite right that it's a problem of lack of will, that taking on the Chinese government is a difficult task in the world today, but it doesn't mean that the definition of genocide legally doesn't apply in this case. It does, to me, appear to apply. And that's one reason why I think the Chinese government is making it very difficult for people to investigate what it's doing in Xinjiang province to the Uyghur minority, the large minority. And I think it's not just the Muslims in China, but also in India that are threatened with genocide, potentially, given the policies of the government. I'd like to just step back a bit from this question of definition and talk about the field, excuse me, of genocide studies and the, I think, rather creative tension that exists between people in two groups in the field of genocide studies. There are some who are academically very rigorous in their scholarship, very intent on being accurate in their reporting and their analysis, and yet also want to make sure that their work contributes to the prevention of genocide. Yeah. They want their work to count in the diplomatic or political and legal arena. And there are others in the field of genocide studies who want to confine their work to the academic arena. And they're also, I think, trying their best to be as academically rigorous and historically and scholarly accurate as they can, but they don't believe it's part of their mission to get involved in lobbying governments or taking on political tasks such as preventing genocide. And they tend to be critical of other genocide scholars who do that, who do try to prevent genocide. But it doesn't mean that their criticisms refer to their scholarly work. I think both groups of people not necessarily unscholarly in their work. Their work can be just as accurate as each other and just as telling. And I think there's a creative tension there between the two groups that both are trying their best to report accurately. It wouldn't be helpful to report inaccurately if you're trying to lobby governments to prevent genocide. And most of the scholars who are trying to do that, to prevent genocide, are very careful in their work and trying to be accurate and scholarly. And I think the same applies to most of the scholars who see themselves in a purely academic light, even though they criticize the others for not being academic. And I do think that there's no harm in that division in the field. I think that there is a way that it works to the benefit of both sides to have that discussion going on about and it increases the rigorous nature of the scholarship in both groups. So on the matter of definitions, I think there are legal definitions, there are sociological definitions. There's totally, in all, I believe, more than 24 definitions that have been put forward for the phenomenon of genocide. It seems to me difficult to look at what happened, at least in the Holocaust, but I think in other cases as well, but just look at the Holocaust and it's very hard not to say that this wasn't a case of genocide and therefore that the term genocide should be abandoned. I think there are many other cases that fit the term genocide as well. And there are other cases which are more difficult to prove legally as having been cases of genocide in history, but they are, in those cases, I think there are many of them that fit the term, a legal term of extermination, a crime against humanity, specifically termed extermination, which is more easy to prove in court. It doesn't require the specific intent, as the lawyers call it, to prove that the perpetrator had that specific intent to destroy an ethnic group or a religious or national or racial group as such, which is a high bar to prove that kind of intent. With extermination, that specific intent is not required to prove the crime of extermination, but it's a crime against humanity. It's very serious. And I think there are many cases of extermination which don't rise to the heinous level of genocide, but they're still heinous. And we should be trying to document those, in my view, prevent them as well. And so I think there are adequate terms in the legal and sociological language to describe many of the outrageous things that human beings have done to one another. And to me, the language is sufficient, but it's also good to hear from other scholars who put up a different view, and we can all discuss that quite positively with some perhaps useful outcome. I think it's good to have the discussion.
Thanks, Ben. I think maybe Doris and Andrew had things they wanted to chime in
Andrew,
about.
you go ahead. I'll come after you.
Thanks, Doris. I'm very slow on the button, so I need all the help I can get. I'd be terrible at Jeopardy. I think I really agree with Ben that I think there's a productive tension between that kind of critical genocide scholarship and engaged genocide scholarship. I am an admirer of Dirk Moses's work as a great example of critical genocide studies in the way that it unsettles us in relation to our concepts, in relation to even like our beloved founder of the field, Lemkin. He really goes at Lemkin in a way that makes many of us uncomfortable because we've done so much work praising Lemkin and seeing his initial essential actions that he took in order to create our field. So, and I think it's quite interesting the way in which he interrogates this and connects how our keyword genocide has been used towards geopolitical processes of securitization and what he calls permanent security. And so it's very important work. And, coming at this topic from working primarily in relation to Indigenous genocides, I'm very invested in the Critical Genocide Project in the sense that genocide terminology, although I agree it fits Indigenous cases on Turtle Island, it also misses some things because it always feels like the Indigenous claimants to genocide always have to try to fit themselves into this rubric, into this grid of interpretation that's been set from a very European framework. And if you look at the creation of genocide law and the United Nations Genocide Convention, you can see many of the modernist and colonial assumptions that it went into thinking about how to define, what is a group, what counts as destruction, and many of the different elements of that law. So there's important work to be done in deconstructing it and critically interrogating that law, so that we don't try to make it, a one-size-fits-all law. I think as a sociologist, the way my approach to genocide and what maybe gets lost in Dirk's interpretation for me is that why genocide as a concept is important is because it speaks specifically to the protection of groups. So as a sociologist, the interesting question is, well, what is a group? What is a collective? How does it persist across time? In what ways is it valuable? What makes it worthy of protection? So this, very basic sociological notion that the group is more than a sum of its parts really seems to me at the core of genocide studies for a sociologist. So, we often begin our definitions from that very question. What is a group? How is it destroyed? And what does it mean to intend to destroy a group? So I think there are those sort of basic elements of the definition that we can adapt to different situations. That gives us sort of a set of guidelines, a framework, without trying to make something that's unadaptable, that's too fixed a framework for interpreting all genocides everywhere and every time and every place.
I think those are really helpful comments, and it brings my mind to one of the, I think, most interesting aspects of the volume of the Cambridge World History of Genocide that I'm co-editing. This question of what comprises a group that can be targeted is something that comes up in different chapters, and it seems to emerge through the volume that in the pre-modern era that the city is a very important collectivity for targeting, for eliminationist violence. So I agree that that's a very foundational and pivotal aspect of dealing with genocide, what comprises a collectivity. And there's interesting sociological questions that are embedded just in talking about what genocide is. Well, thanks for that. I think, Doris, you wanted to chime in.
I wanted to jump in something on the definition, which actually fits in with what you're saying about the group. A few years ago, I was involved with this project on Mennonites and the Holocaust. And we really had to work hard, the editors, Mark Jansen and John Thiessen and I, so that the project wouldn't just get bogged down in defining, well, who even talks about a Mennonite? Like who even counts? And I just came up with this concept of defining to distraction. And I think it's really important to talk about definition, but the goal of your scholarship shouldn't be, aha, I found the label that fits. That's not the end point, that's the beginning point. So I think to try to avoid that, defining to distraction is really important. And thinking about the word of genocide, I mean, maybe this is too simplistic, but I find for me, it's helpful to think about words that we use in more than one layer. You know what I mean? So think about a word like bribery. Bribery is a crime. There's a legal definition of what constitutes bribery. But bribery is also the thing you do when you give your kid, a candy so that, I don't know, they do something that you want them to do. And you can use bribery in both those two senses, or murder is the same thing. There's murder, a legal definition, but then there's the way that you can use murder, especially as a historian, to describe an event.
Yes.
And I feel like genocide, for me at least, can kind of work in this way as well. Like, I'm not an international lawyer, you know what I mean? I don't have to make that call. I can be, in a way, not a one size fits all. So, you know, maybe it's not too rigorous, but, and on that note, I was also thinking, Ben, about the two groups. So interesting to see that. And I want to add a third group. I think at least there's a third group of super important people working on genocide. And those are the people who are maybe not so rigorous, who are gathering those personal accounts, who are making the movies and the films and the art. And I think like most of what goes into the public discourse of genocide comes from that group. And many of them are scholars too, but they might be in, you know, the music department, or they might be in the film department. And so that conversation between the political scientists or the historians or the sociologists or the anthropologists and this people who are really not only representing genocide, but researching it, but from really different angles. I feel like that third group is super important, and the creative tension applies there as well.
Interesting. I think another major area of discussion in genocide studies has centered on the question of modernity, and whether genocide is a product of specific features that are distinctive to modernity or even constitutive of modernity. Has the field moved past this question? Is the existence of volumes devoted to the world history of genocide necessarily indicative that the modernity hypothesis of genocide can't be maintained? Or is it compelling, in fact, to argue the aspects of modernity do shape genocidal violence in significant ways? Would anyone like to opine on this? I'm sure Ben has things to say about this issue.
Well, I think there are two intertwined categories here, that whether genocide is firstly a modern phenomenon, and whether also it's a Western phenomenon. If we think about the Holocaust as something that happened in the West, or at least under a German Nazi regime, a Western regime, and also when we think about the work that has emphasized that genocide came about under the rise of nation states, largely in the West. Again, it's emphasizing the Western origins of Western and European origins of nation states, and that genocide emerged in that context. And then also the emphasis on the genocides that did take place under settler colonial regimes, mostly Western European or American colonial regimes in the Western Hemisphere. Again, we have this emphasis on genocide as a phenomenon that came from the West. And that's one of the things that, one of the ideas or themes running through the study of genocide, I think, that we wanted to take on in these 3 volumes, to see what was the nature of genocide in 6 continents. Volumes 1 and 2 look at 5 continents. Volume 3 looks at 6. We wanted to see, you know, what was the real truth about this, you know, so-called Western origin and nature of genocide, and whether it had origins elsewhere, whether it was something that was more cosmopolitan or international or transnational than that. And I think we've found, you know, cases where genocide took place which had nothing to do with Western influence, not only in prehistory, like in the prehistoric Andes, and in other places in Southern Africa. Michael Mahoney has a chapter on genocide committed by a particular Zulu monarch, and we have cases of mass violence conducted by a Native American society or regime in the Western Hemisphere, but perhaps under pressure from Western colonial presence, but at the instigation of a Native American polity at the time. And so we also have a panoramic chapter, if I may say so, by Victoria Hui on mass killing and extermination and genocide in Chinese history, which has, at least its beginnings, and for long after that, no specific connection to Western influences. And we actually have 4 chapters, including that one on China. That's in volume 1, but in volumes 2 and 3, we have 3 more chapters on events in Chinese history that qualify as genocide, and a 5th chapter on a genocide in China conducted by the Japanese, the Nanjing massacre, by the Japanese scholar Yuki Tanaka. So we have plenty of cases of genocide well outside the Western sphere or well outside Western influence, and not just in China and Africa and Native America, North and South, but the Vietnamese conducted a genocide of the Cham people in Southeast Asia in the late 15th century. So there, I think we can say now, that there isn't any specific national or continental origin to genocide. It's unfortunately a human experience that the world shares, that really predates modernity as well. I think we can say that perhaps the technological capacity that comes with modernity has accelerated the capacity to conduct genocide. We have, I think it's 30 genocides in volume 3 between World War I and the present, documented in volume 3. That's just for the last 100 years. So there's certainly the rapidity and frequency of genocide has increased in modern times. Perhaps also the documentation of genocide has increased in modern times. So it's not all that clear that there were far fewer genocides in ancient and medieval and early modern times, but I think that's probably the case. Certainly the technological capacity has increased in modern times, but the human decision-making is still there in earliest times and early modern times as well. And even when we see so much of the European domination spread across the world and genocides conducted by settler colonial powers, there are still others, non-Western powers, that have committed genocide in the same period. I think one of the things that has led to genocide, the themes that I was talking about earlier, war, immiseration, poverty, economic instability, political crisis, all of these kinds of what I call the long-term causes of genocide can occur at any stage in history, and they do make it possible for genocidal groups or leaders to recruit supporters who are destabilized or displaced from their homes and open to being recruited into new armed groups. And if the leaders of those groups who recruit them happen to be the sorts of people who wish to unleash them in a genocidal campaign, that is the short-term immediate causes of genocide, the human decisions that do that, then these historical long-term causes, the structural factors, climate change, and so on, these are, factors that go back a long way in history and are not necessarily tied to modernity.
As someone who's worked on ancient genocide, I of course agree with that, and am happy to see more emphasis or more work being done on genocides in antiquity and prehistory, because I think that there has been sort of short shrift paid to this previously. There have been other genocides that scholars of different areas have argued have not been enough of a focus of scholars. I know that there are some scholars within Indigenous studies who have argued, even within the past 10 years, that Indigenous issues have been neglected within genocide studies. Andrew, since this is your area, perhaps you could speak to this.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to add a little bit about modernity and genocide, just to say that probably one of the reasons why genocide scholars have so frequently found modernity central to genocide is because they've been so thoroughly modernist themselves in their thinking. I mean, they tend to think in very binaristic ways in terms of creating separations between nature and culture, life, death, what else we got here, like human and the non-human. So this sort of categorical thinking leads to filtering out all sorts of other factors that may be considered part of more similar to pre-modern or ancient experiences of genocide. So we tend to see things through a lens that creates a very modernist picture of what genocide is. So I'll probably talk about that maybe a little bit in relation to the question you are asking me, which is about Indigenous studies. And I think it's fair to say genocides of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island have for a long time been marginal in genocide studies. This is not to say that the terminology genocide hasn't been long used by Indigenous elders, survivors, political leaders, Indigenous scholars, and allied historians and social scientists and others who have, I've traced at least back to the 1950s, people using this terminology to describe experiences of Indigenous peoples in this part of the world. The case has received less attention from genocide scholars themselves, particularly in a lot of the early, sort of big comparative books on genocide. Clearly not this current one, so that's great. But sometimes I would say particularly Canada has been only a recent addition to comparative studies of genocide. It hasn't been entirely ignored, but when you look at the massive books that have been produced on comparative genocides, it's fairly marginal. But that's been changing in recent years thanks to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, the unmarked graves, and other such occurrences that have brought this issue more to the fore. But one thing that still maybe gets neglected in terms of Indigenous genocides, and one thing, let me just step back a little bit, because the periodization of Indigenous genocides is always difficult for me, and maybe there's maybe as sociologists and historians have different periodizations of where modernity starts, but certainly I would see Indigenous genocides as part of a long history traversing several historical periods. I mean, some of what is ongoing today in terms of Indigenous dispossession and destruction is still framed in a language that could come from John Locke or René Descartes or some Enlightenment thinker or some great thinker of modernity, in terms of the ways in which they see someone's ability to possess property, to have property, particularly with Locke I'm thinking of here. So I see this more as a long genocide, a slow genocide that's taken place over a vast period, rather than something that's contemporary or ancient or one or the other. But I think one of the things that still gets missed in genocide studies is what's often at the core of the experience of genocide for Indigenous communities, and that is dispossession. So I'm really looking forward to that Ned Blackhawk chapter on settler colonial dispossession, because I think that'll be a great addition to the genocide studies discussion, where the loss of land and how land is not just something that's possessed by the community and something that is a resource that the community relies on to survive. It's something that's actually part of the community. It's part of the identity. It's part of how Indigenous peoples and their cosmovisions often define themselves as people. So land is a much more lively presence within Indigenous understandings of the group than genocide studies often allows. And therefore genocide studies often misses this key dimension and simply, relegates Indigenous genocides to being, sometimes they're called instrumental genocides, or similar terminology is used to describe, that these were not so much about destroying a people for who they are, but for access to their land. And I think that takes away some of the complexity of what is actually happening through settler colonial forms of destruction.
Interesting. Thank you for that, Andrew. On the topic of neglected areas, question for you, Victoria. Ben raised the kind of question about how much genocide is Western. How much do you think Eurocentrism has affected the study of genocide, particularly in your areas of research?
Great, thank you so much. So the funny thing is that when we use the term Eurocentrism, and we should avoid that, usually it's because, for so long, people presume that Europeans would think that they're superior to people in the rest of the world. And that sentiment in recent years got flipped. So now then it's presumption that the European world is, I guess, in international relations, security studies, the European world is basically Hobson's state of war of all against all, whereas the rest of the world is not like that. The rest of the world is supposed to be all peaceful and nice, unlike the Europeans. And so this is a problem. So when people they say, we should correct for Eurocentrism and look to the East. Very often the problem is that they have substituted Eurocentrism with Sinocentrism. So instead of really, when people look at Asia, instead of looking at, Asian relations, Chinese relations with Korea, with Central Asian empires, with Vietnam, instead they only look at all these Chinese records. And so in that sense, it's like, Chinese emperors would always like to say that we are benevolent, and, if we use force, it's because we have no choice but to punish these bandits. And the problem then is, if we have to look at the other side, we should really go all the way out, that we really have to look at, hear the voices of the real underdog. This is one problem. And then also going back to kind of the pre-modern hypothesis, I suppose that Ben mentioned, technology capacity, technology of weapons. This is often the main reason why people would associate genocide with the modernity. The thing is that ultimately it is about people who want power, who want to conquer. And in a way that we see what Putin is doing in Ukraine: surrender. If you don't, be slaughtered, be enslaved, be raped. And in a way that throughout history, people had no qualms about this. Now today, Beijing would go around to lobby in different countries in the UN that don't use the designation of genocide. But when the Mongols slaughter everyone, they had no qualms about any UN entity calling them genocide. So I would say that almost like historically, this phenomenon was way more common. And then another thing about looking at history is also interesting that that now we can see mass graves. So we can use archaeological evidence to identify genocide. But what is also interesting about Chinese history, now we want to really look at Vietnamese and Korean and Central Asian versions of their relations with China. But Chinese history itself is so overloaded with basically bragging about how many people we killed. It's funny because essentially victories is a good thing. And if you kill people, a lot of people, it means that you are much more capable emperor. And so these historical records dating back to over 2,000 years ago. Now, the use of words kind of really tells us about what the culture cares about. For example, Southern Chinese cannot distinguish between ice and snow because they don't have not seen it. And it's often noted that the Chinese language, because supposedly familial relations are very important, hierarchical relations are very important. So you have different terms for the family, for the paternal side and the maternal side and all that. If that's the case, we apply the same logic. And so I look at these words that mean extermination, mass killing, they're massive. There's so many words to designate extermination and mass killing. And even with the idea that we want to have extermination of a particular group. So in a way that even though we don't have the exact term genocide that we use today in the 20th century, but if we look at for these other terms and in the context, we actually see basically pretty massive records.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting. Do you see this history of ostentatious killing and the kind of widespread use of genocidal violence in Chinese history as influencing contemporary acts of violence or suppression, like the Uyghur crisis that you were talking about earlier, or is it a separate phenomenon, do you think?
No, because people do change over time. But so at the same time, though, I don't think China is usually, earlier I mentioned that historically rulers were emperors or empire builders did not really have any qualms about mass killing. I don't think that the Chinese government has any qualm, even though they want to have the cake and eat it too. So what is interesting is when people look to China, they would like to say, oh, it has to be all about peace and no killing and no violence, because look at what Confucius says. Look at what Mencius says. Now, the interesting thing is that very often that when we look at China's tradition, we look at not just, Confucius and Mencius. There's actually another strategist, a thinker, much more prominently known. That is Sun Ji. Sun Ji's Art of War says that you want to win without war. And in a way that what we are seeing is that, so Xi Jinping, just in his speech at the 20th Party Congress, he said that we want to follow China's tradition. And they used to talk more about these Confucian terms, benevolence and harmony and all that. So they don't even use those terms anymore. Now, China's tradition has basically on both sides. If you want to find peace, you can find it. If you want to find violence, you can find it. But what seems to be very interesting is that they claim that what they've been doing in Xinjiang is counterterrorism. You look at the United States, US counterterrorism campaign involves killing all these people. We don't do that. We put them in re-education camps. And then we put them, in jobs, which is another word for forced labor. That means borrowing from Sun Ji's winning without war. So you try to commit genocide without killing them immediately. So you don't send them to the gas chamber, but you're actually doing more or less the same thing with forced sterilization, forced abortion, taking kids out of the family, many cases of rape, and also putting people in concentration camps. So you know what exactly it is if it is not, but they're very smart. They can claim that, we're still peaceful because we don't kill.
Very interesting. This brings me to the question of policy. We've already discussed a bit the advocacy side of genocide studies, which I think has been very prominent since the beginning. And there's been this pragmatic impulse to prevent these things that we are studying, with the knowledge, I would say, that our decisions and our actions can never be morally neutral, I would say, as a counter to people who would criticize this. But since prevention of genocides has always been part of the field, I mean, this is a question for Lindsay, since you're in political science. In what ways do you think genocide studies has contributed to policy work regarding genocide and genocide prevention? Do you think that policymakers and diplomats and NGOs have drawn upon genocide studies research? Are we being heard, as it were?
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. I think there's really sort of three relevant groups here to consider. So there's the activists, there's the policymakers, and then there's us scholars.
Yes.
And I think sometimes the boundaries between these three groups, they're not sharp all the time. But I think what is somewhat problematic is that these groups aren't interacting as much as they should or as much as they could. And we all have a lot to learn from each other. And I would actually add in, I guess, another group that Doris had mentioned earlier, sort of the more artistic side. So those who are doing the films. And I mean, I've seen this with the case study I work on the most, Rwanda. Most of the public's knowledge of the Rwandan genocide comes from the film Hotel Rwanda. It's a completely inaccurate portrayal of the genocide, but this is their frame of reference. And these kinds of things can actually bleed into policy, or at least bleed into sort of the way that the public is understanding, that country in the situation post-genocide. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement. I think in terms of genocide scholars, I think there's room to more effectively translate our research and discoveries for the public and activists and policymakers. And I don't mean by dumbing down, but writing in a more accessible language. I always find that there's still so much of the scholarship that is so jargon filled that it would be very hard for people in other fields, let alone like the public or policymakers, to have a firm grasp of it. So I think there is a lot of room for improvement. I also, I think like the activist sort of impulse within the study is still a very positive thing. I think there have been times when, we've seen negative repercussions from it. Probably the more famous example is Darfur, when I think it was in 2005, the International Association of Genocide Scholars adopted a resolution for military intervention there. And I think a lot of people who were on the ground at the time and really understood that conflict intimately really felt that was not what should be called for. And sometimes there's a bit of a rush to sort of get news about an event out to the public really quickly. And that can have some ramifications. And I think what we saw in 2005 with Darfur was that this crisis, we were looking at one episode of violence. We weren't considering it entirely within sort of a broader temporal analysis of Sudanese politics and Darfur's place within that. So I think, sometimes it has to be tempered, that activist impulse, but I think it's, it's a positive thing in this field, I think.
Doris, go ahead.
Can I jump in on that? So interesting, what Lindsay was saying about policy. And I wanted to add another, I guess, sort of branch, which is education, thinking about policy and education. Because, the discussion around prevention, I always think about, what if studying a genocide doesn't lead to prevention? Would that mean you wouldn't study it? What if, and this I remember, Ben, from your Blood and Soil book, what if sometimes people study genocide precisely because they want to commit it, not to, and so in that sense, like, the history or the education is like, it's not so simple equation, like, oh, knowing more, somehow leads to a better outcome. And there's also, I think, another important factor, which is the way sometimes knowledge of like destruction in the past is used to justify erasure in the present. And I think we see that a lot, right? It's like, oh, well, like I have a colleague, Melanie Newton, who's a historian of the Caribbean. She works in the early modern period, and she worked on like Garifuna people, and like the Spaniards, the British, the French, they all declared they're extinct. That race is extinct. But of course, they're not, but that declaration repeatedly that those people have all been destroyed itself becomes a stigma, on them and a way of erasing them in the present. And I think this is why the long term and exactly what Andrew was saying is so important too. So, I mean, I think it's great that there are people working on policy and prevention, but I think, for me at least, that's not the only reason or even the main reason. It's like, what if it didn't prevent anything? What if sometimes it even gets in the wrong hands? Still, I don't know, don't we owe it to people, who lived and died, that their bodies not just be erased like garbage, like they never mattered, like they had no meaning? So yeah, I think that topic is really complex.
So really interesting comments. I think the education piece, it's something that I've been thinking a bit about in the past few months. And Victoria's comment about this sort of Hobbesian view of European history. I worry at times that when people receive a superficial education in genocide studies or in Holocaust studies, that they are left with this kind of total depravity view of human nature. And I actually think that that can lead to an impulse of non-intervention, non-activism, because if you think that people are by nature violent, then I think the natural response to that is defensive. It's a defensive response. It's a self-protective response. It's using violence, to putatively, protect against what is going to be some eventual encroachment, because that's the way human beings are. And so it seems like something we have to do very carefully. And when I teach classes on violence, like the Bible and violence and religious violence, I'm very careful to try to prevent students from falling into this kind of Hobbesian frame, which I think is ultimately self-defeating to violence prevention. And I also think that it can lead to anti-democratic tendencies. I mean, I've been worried about this since I first taught a class on violence in 2007, and we obviously have seen this kind of pessimistic view of humanity going together with anti-democratic tendencies very much occurring in recent years. So I agree that the education piece is tricky. It's trickier than people think. There seems to be an assumption like whatever education we do is better than nothing, but it does seem to matter how we do it, I think. Lindsay?
Yeah, just when you were saying that, it reminded me, I mean, a really famous example of this is with Yugoslavia and sort of the dominant narratives at the time that were within both the media and some scholars. And I remember, the book Balkan Ghost, which very much sort of painted a picture of Yugoslavia as having been this historically very troubled area where the people are just prone to fighting, for centuries. And, Bill Clinton at the time, well, later, he admitted that he had read that quite recently at the time. And that very much influences thinking about keeping the US out. Sort of this idea that there was no use in trying to intervene because these people were destined to fight. So I agree with you. The way we educate about these is really important as well. And I mean, the media is so influential here. With Rwanda, it was the same sort of narrative that these are, these ancient hatreds have just fueled them forever. And this is nothing new. The genocide isn't anything new. There are always, these episodes of horrendous violence. So and that contributed as well to the sort of public and policy-making spheres.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that.
Can I just jump in here?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Ben.
on the question of both policy and education, we have a terrific chapter on Rwanda in Volume 3 by Scott Strauss, who's actually a political scientist and not a historian, but he ends the volume as well with another chapter, a short history of genocide prevention in the long 20th century, with some ideas about genocide prevention moving forward. And on the education issue, the destruction of the Pequot people in the 17th century here in Connecticut, where I'm speaking from, was considered to have a precedent in the Bible. As you know from your two terrific chapters in Volume 1, Tracy, the destroyers of the Pequot, the genocide perpetrators, said that the Pequots will be destroyed just like Amalek was in ancient Israel. And that's an example of knowledge being misused and used as a precedent for another genocide. And so the idea that the Tasmanian Aborigines were wiped out totally was used, just like the other case that was mentioned, that there were no survivors, was used to the disadvantage of the survivors. The people who had survived despite everything were just erased for many, many years in Tasmania. And I think one thing that we learned perhaps from Holocaust scholarship that was not so productive was this division of the participants into perpetrators, bystanders, and victims. That there are also survivors, people who actually fought to survive, not just victims, but people who positively stood up and survived. And there's also the people who fought back, resistance. I think resistance still tends to be understudied and underestimated in many of these cases of genocide. The focus is so often on the crimes of the perpetrators, necessarily to a large extent, documenting the crimes of the perpetrators and bringing justice for the victims. But the people who stood up and fought back and inflicted casualties on the perpetrators, thereby reducing their capacity to commit further crimes, the resistance is understudied, and its importance is less well known than it should be. And I think that's a case in many of these genocidal situations, because many of the people in the resistance end up being killed or silenced, and their stories remain unknown. But they have reduced the capacity of the perpetrators to kill even more people than they did.
And it seems that for genocide prevention, that understanding the mechanisms by which people are willing and able to resist seems just as important as understanding the mechanisms that lead people to kill. So I think that's a great point. I do want to get to Q&A soon, so I have a couple of questions remaining, and I guess we'll just have to deal with them rather quickly. I do think they're important questions, so I'll just raise them so we can quickly address them. I think one of the most important aspects of the Cambridge World History of Genocide, in my view anyway, is how it makes clear the confluence of factors, a kind of multi-causal approach to genocide that includes treatment of material factors, environmental factors. And in our era of climate change and ecological stresses, I think that considering the implications of this for the rise of genocide, the emergence of genocide and genocide prevention seems quite important. Is this something that genocide studies needs to grapple with as a field? How, you know, some of the ecological changes that we're seeing could actually lead to stresses that cause more genocides. I think, Andrew, you had wanted to talk about this, and then Doris, you can go after that.
Yeah, sure. I think there is important work being done looking at ecological destruction as a risk factor for genocide, as well as work looking at the connections between ecocide and genocide. But one way I'd like to see this pushed a little bit further is, I don't want to say getting to a post-anthropocentric genocide studies, but a less anthropocentric genocide studies. I think much of our model focuses on those human relations, and we don't even have to look just to contemporary or future genocides to see the role that the environment, that the material world plays in genocide. It's always been there. It's always been part of genocidal processes. When you read transcripts from survivors, and of course, this is very prominent from Indigenous survivors, and I think Indigenous ontologies have a lot to teach us about understanding the role of nature within the group, the role of the more than human world within the group, and how it is much more active and less passive than we often treat it. But I think if you read transcripts from survivors, whether it's from Rwanda, Cambodia, Armenia, you'll often see people recount their experiences, not just with reference to the lost loved ones, family, and friends, but also to the physical world around them. Whether it's Mount Ararat in Armenia, or relationships with rice rituals in the rice paddy in Cambodia. I mean, obviously, this isn't true for every single person who's been experienced genocide, but there are relationships with the natural world that are imbued within all human groups that make them more than human groups, make them associations of humans and the natural world. So I think that's one area where we need to get less fixated on just the human sufferers of genocide.
I mean, even going back to ancient cases of genocide, we see this connection very clearly. I mean, in biblical passages that call for genocide or describe it, in some cases you have the killing of livestock along with the killing of particular ethnic groups, or in Mesopotamian sources, descriptions of like eerie silence, of cities and the environment around places of killing. So I think that's a great point, Andrew. Doris, did you want to remark?
Yeah, first on that point, I've also made me think about genocide of Herero and Nama. The Germans massacred all those cattle, and then they died of a plague too. But the remark I wanted to make is on another side. I think it's so important to think about the environmental issues, but I also feel like, at least from my experience, it's really important to kind of emphasize that it's not the poor and destitute people of this world who carry out the genocide. And when there's genocides around the shortages of resources, it's the wealthy people protecting their rights to the resources. You know what I mean? And I sometimes see like public audiences or students, like they immediately want to go to the path of, oh, the Germans killed Jews because Germans were poor and Jews were rich. I was like, okay, first of all, neither of those things are true. And secondly, like that's so, but the idea like blaming, you know what I mean? Like desperate and destitute people. And I'm sorry, like I haven't counted in your volume, but I would say when those flashpoints occur around shortages, it's the people with the resources that are much more likely to be carrying out the genocide than the people who are the most vulnerable without them. So I just want to throw that in.
Sure. Or manipulating people who are very vulnerable, very vulnerable.
Commanding the genocide.
Yes, exactly.
If I may add a little bit to that is in a way that, so what we've seen in Tibet and Xinjiang is that these nomads and people actually traditionally knew how to live with the land, how to protect the environment. But when these nomads are driven out and they're forced to settle, and then the lands are taken from them for development, this is so in a way that we often think of, I suppose that the question presumes ecological problems contributes to the genocide, but maybe genocide also contributes to ecological disasters.
Yes, certainly. Well, there's one final question that I feel we need to address. I think many of us have an interest in memorialization of genocide, responses to genocide, redress, and recovery from genocide. And has Genocide Studies done enough work in this area? What more should we do? Is this an area that needs to be one of greater focus on how communities heal, how communities seek redress from genocide? I know that Lindsay has an interest in this. Andrew has certainly worked on this. Ben has worked on this. So I'm interested in hearing what you all have to say about it.
I can start off. I think this is an area where we're seeing increasing engagement with. One area that I think there is greater need for attention is the issue of denial. And in some genocides, this is really preventing the survivors from being able to truly move on. So with I do some work with the Rwandan survivor community here in London, Ontario. And when you ask them sort of what are their biggest challenges, they almost always, the answer is unanimous, and that is dealing with deniers and dealing with denialist narratives. And the narratives are much more complex than I think we sort of often realize or how we often take them at face value. With Rwanda, there's all different strains of denialist narratives. They have progressed through time, but they also sort of coalesce into new stories about the genocide. Just a few years ago, there was a famous book that came out by Judy Revere, Canadian journalist, and it was really a complete rewriting of what had happened in Rwanda. But the traction this got was astounding. And I think the genocide studies community needs to call this out more and engage with this, and engage with the communities of deniers as well. And this is not only just from like the media or perpetrators, but also there's still academics as well. So I think this is an area that we sort of need to understand a lot better.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly. I agree with Lindsay. I think there's a lot of really good work being done in this area in genocide studies and beyond. I mean, genocide studies is kind of a smaller group of people, but there's so much adjacent work to genocide studies that also covers these topics. That's really valuable. I think one of the things that I'm finding, particularly from younger scholars, they want to know is not just how to understand, the how or why of memorialization or to redress, and not just to critically assess the politics of redress, but how can they engage with it in a meaningful way, which is very hard for young scholars in particular to engage in the sort of community-based projects one needs to be participating in order to do so, particularly around working with Indigenous communities, to do so in a decolonizing or at least an unsettled way. So I think, I know a lot of scholars in genocide studies have had engagements with the communities where it's not just about, filling notches on their CV. They're actually working with communities, helping the communities figure out how to realize their goals and their objectives. And I think if we can share more of that knowledge, but also create opportunity structures for young scholars where their work is rewarded for doing that kind of work, and they're not set back or less likely to get grants or publications or things they need in order to pursue their careers. I think it's a real challenge, a real difficult balance to make. So
I think that's a terrific idea.
Well, any final thoughts before we move to audience Q&A? We've covered a wide swath of questions here, which I think is good. Well, go ahead, Ben.
I would just like to emphasize the importance of the story of resistance, because I think for many communities who suffered genocide, the idea that it was somehow inevitable, that it was something that couldn't have been stopped, and that if they find out more, if the story of resistance to genocide becomes more widely known, I think it might give more hope to communities, that more inspiration that that there was an alternative. It wasn't just something that happened to them that was inevitable, but it wasn't their culture that's to blame or their society, but there were people in their society that took risks and inflicted casualties on the perpetrators and reduced the scale of the genocide. I think more research on that issue might be helpful for healing and redress.
Thanks, Ben. Well, I see some questions. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Victoria. Wait.
Sorry, I just want to go off what was Ben said about resistance. The worry is that if genocide goes so well with the state's capacity to coerce, to track who, all the people they really want to target. And it used to be, China was very good at conducting census, knowing who lives where, who is who. And also with Rwanda, and a very important tool was basically also the population registry. Today, then, it's just very worrisome trend is that with AI technology. So what the Uyghurs have been subject to is facial recognition, voice recognition, biometric data, even posture recognition, because so many of them who managed to get out, it was like why we were told to move around and run around in front of this huge mirror. And so with dramatically increased capacity for genocide, resistance gets it becomes, the room for that is almost nil at this point in Xinjiang. So that's actually a echo Ben's call to look more at resistance, but it is also kind of like another area that it's very worrisome.
Yes, and that's something that we haven't covered today, and if we had more time would be, I think, important to cover the relationship between technology and genocide. We've sort of touched on that a little bit, but you point to something that does need to be examined more, and needs to be the subject probably of a lot of policy making. Well, let me look at this Q&A now. I see that there's some questions that have accumulated. I have to scroll through this for a moment here. That's one thing with these webinars. It's a little bit less natural than somebody raising their hand. So you'll bear with me for a moment. Let's see. Okay. Some comments about specific groups. Okay. I think Owen Vermersch is saying that he has a question. Maybe you could type out your question, Owen, because that's the way the Q&A is being conducted. So if you type it out, then the panel can address it. Okay, someone has asked, with Andrew's recent point about young scholars, is there something that the field can do to assist and integrate upcoming postgraduates into the cutthroat entry environment of academia?
I mean, one thing we've been battling at our university at a faculty association level is making sure that trying to avoid university top-down imposed performance criteria, to allow and to set our own standards for performance criteria within departments to allow us to consider the broader forms of contribution scholars might make. So the way I see that as a possible answer to this question is that we're trying to make space for emerging scholars to come into our department where they don't necessarily fit that cookie cutter model of someone who's, you know, had a postdoc and published, you know, more articles than many of our assistant professors have, you know, in that competitive world. I think also part of the challenge is, you know, being able to introduce graduate students into our projects that are already community-based and to give them that sort of way in where the ethics process, the making connections, the process of making connections with research participants or with your community partners won't take as long, so that it can be done within a graduate degree or a PhD degree timeline. But you know, for the broader changes, I think in terms of the cutthroat entry, I mean, I think there's got to be more scholars, you know, insisting on slow scholarship, you know, moving away from fetishizing impact factors and all the other different quantitative measures by which we're supposed to assess ourselves, and to allow scholars to shine in the different ways that they might shine in their career. So that's not a full answer, but I'll leave the rest to someone else.
I'd also just add the International Association for Genocide Scholars has quite an active emerging scholars program. And so they, there's a regular sort of forum for this. And then there's also like a mentorship program where newly emerging scholars are paired with a senior genocide studies scholar. So I would encourage them to look into this, because it's quite an active program that they have going for emerging scholars.
Okay, thank you. There was a question from someone in the audience about violence against Daga people in Vietnam, and asking what can be done to raise awareness about violence towards certain groups. You know, if someone is from a group or if someone is doing activist work for a group, what are the best ways to raise awareness of the violence occurring?
I guess I suppose that, you know, what the Uyghurs have done is actually, so what I was just talking about, you know, resistance inside Xinjiang is very bleak, but it's also interesting that the people, why we know the story about genocide in Xinjiang. First of all, when news first emerged that there were these re-education camps, people actually, everyone looked basically, it was like, it's not possible. We're in the 21st century. There's no genocide. We cannot, you know, this has to be made up. And then some scholars, actually just a few scholars, one person who was actually a Tibet expert, because you can't go there to travel, and because you also really can't talk to people. Anyone from inside who talks to you, they themselves get into trouble, pretty serious trouble. So one scholar, he was looking at all of these open bids for constructions and open calls for jobs. Why all of a sudden that you need to look for, you know, thousands of security officers? What's that for? So this is one thing, is all open source. And then he took that, used the same method to then look at open sources in the Xinjiang region. He identified exactly the same call for you. Why do you suddenly need to hire tens of thousands of security officers? And then he also found all these bids for construction that look exactly the same, and also specify watchtowers, barbed wires. Why would you need this? And then RFA Radio Free Asia, they have a bunch of Uyghur reporters who have families back home. And they realized something was wrong when their family members wouldn't talk to them anymore. Well, first of all, they wouldn't talk to them in the Turkic language. They would only talk to them in Mandarin, and then they wouldn't say anything. And so very soon, then all these people disappear. So RV kept talking about, basically try to push these stories, and people didn't believe until, again, when these construction and employment basically got released. And then another Chinese student looking at Google Earth, and these Google Earth images, if you compare what happened before 2016, before 2017, and then what you see today, all of these look-alike constructions that essentially corroborate with another scholar who was looking at these bits. And what do you use them for? So finally, Beijing said that, you know, they had to admit that, you know, something's going on. This is when they said that these are re-education camps. And how do we know more about these stories? Is that anyone who had any connection, who had relatives or family members overseas, basically they will all be automatically sent to these camps. But at the same time, a lot of those who are, for example, Kazakh citizens, or people who it's someone from Egypt were married to Egyptian. Those people eventually they were released from these concentration camps or forced labor camps, and then they could go out and tell the stories. And they have done an amazing job at lobbying. For example, Notre, he is the commissioner for international religious liberties, and he's from Uyghur. He's a Uyghur. He's from China, and they got together to lobby. And finally, the U.S. government, first under the last month of Trump, and then also with the Biden administration, they agreed to use the designation of genocide, no less because of all these stories, because, you know, Uyghurs themselves have to compile these stories, and then also work very hard to push for this designation when the Museum of Holocaust refused to do it, when the UN Human Rights Commission refused to use it.
Thanks for that, Victoria. I think that's a really useful outlining of kind of multi-pronged approach that different people have used to trace what's going on, identify what's going on, and call, you know, the perpetrator state to account for it. That's really helpful. There's a couple of other, there's more questions are emerging here. There's a question about, in order to understand, explore the degree of barbarity, should we also consider terms like democide or politicide side by side with genocide? I think this is fairly common in the field to use other terms. I know, you know, in our volume, there's the term ethnocide is considered, the terms herbicide are considered. So I think that this is something that is done to good effect. I don't know if you have any comments about this, Ben. Oh, I think you might have to unmute.
Thanks for the question. I think Rudolf Rummel invented the term democide to talk about huge numbers of people being killed or starved to death that were not in any particular group. You know, that this is just a term for unspecific mass killing or extermination on a huge scale. I think he was implying that were not targeted at any particular ethnic, national, racial, or religious group, which would qualify as genocide, but could involve political groups or social or economic groups. But he used the term democide to imply huge population groups. Mm-hmm. And I think there is some sense to that term, which avoids the specificity of genocide or even extermination. it perhaps includes possible non-criminal acts that are resulting from state, negligence or criminal negligence that might not qualify as extermination or genocide, but certainly are the result or the fault of a state or a group of political group conducting democide. I think there is a sense in inventing that term as he did. Then we have ethnocide, which is possibly a bit more problematic because it doesn't necessarily imply killing, but rather what is often called cultural genocide. The loss of a culture or of a religion over a long term. I find those terms a little bit more problematic than genocide, extermination, or even democide. But as long as the author who's using those terms is specific about what they're talking about and clear about what they mean by those terms, I think it contributes to the discussion. But if the terms are just bandied about, implying things that the reader might not be clear about, I don't think that's helpful.
I agree. As I think you might recall, I have some skepticism about the use of the term ethnocide to mean cultural genocide, because it's quite counterintuitive to me. You would think that it would mean the killing of an ethnos, or an ethnic group. And so that is the way that I've used it in things I've published, because I think that's just an intuitive use that makes linguistic sense. So that's where terms start to, if they're counterintuitive, then I sort of question how useful that is. But there's a question that maybe a couple of different people might be interested in answering. I would think Andrew probably would address this. Well, someone asked how you, as a scholar, build relationships of trust in order to be able to do this kind of work, particularly work on healing and redress. How, if you're not from within a community, how do you build relationships of trust with people within a community in order to do this work? Or maybe it's too big of a question. It is a big question, but it's important, I think.
Well, yeah, and there's a certain amount of luck and randomness involved in terms of, like, some of the friendships I've made have just come through just just fluke luck, opportunity. I did want to say there was someone I was trying to type an answer into, and I actually said that I would answer live. So that person wants to retype their question. It was the last one about genocide denial in Canada. I was going to send them some information. But in terms of like making connections with the community, I think one thing is really important. When I first made a connection with one survivor, and all it took was one, good relationship to then be able to get introduced to other members of the community as someone who can be trusted. So establishing trust takes a long time, but with this particular group of survivors I worked with, the first 2 years of our project were spent just getting to know each other. So we met about 4 times a year, and we never got down what we were working on, building a virtual reality residential school that was going to model the school many of these survivors had attend and would be useful as a space of commemoration and for a way for them to educate their grandchildren about what they experienced. But in trying to get that project underway, we they had a lot of questions for us, and one of my colleagues made the mistake saying, well, we want to know what we can do as experts to help you out. And when the survivors turned to him and said, you're not the experts here, we're the experts. What do you want from us, and what do you bring to the table? Is so you get asked tough questions, and being able to answer those questions, I think, in an honest and in a way that is very respectful and understanding that, no one owes you anything. The question is, what can you give back to the community, and to always be thinking about what can you give back? Can you offer something to the group you're working with, in order to ensure that this isn't just a one-way exchange.
I think that's a good answer. Thanks, Andrew. There's, I think, maybe one remaining question on LGBT. I'll just read it out. It's somewhat long. Do you believe taking away rights from LGBT peoples or expressing dominant gender roles in society is a way of eradicating, or a hidden non-direct way of having, a genocide of LGBT peoples? Although I understand we have made progress for rights and have become more widely accepted, can we recognize the unspoken agenda of gender roles and forced identities in society, and how this ties into an attempt of genocide of expression or cultural genocide? This is an interesting question. I guess, as a lesbian, I'll maybe answer from my own kind of perspective on this. Obviously it would be possible. There would be clear cases of genocides of LGBT people if you had targeted killings, if you had people being placed in concentration camps or severe suppression. In terms of gender roles in themselves, it makes me worry about expanding the category of genocide so much that we start to lose some analytical value of it, because gender roles in societies are so commonplace. They might differ in different societies, but it would be, I'll say, incredibly rare. I'm not familiar with any societies where you don't have gender roles and where children are not socialized with gender roles. So I'm not sure about this. I think that there would be cases where it would rise to the level of genocide, of course, and there have been scholars who've worked on this. And I mean, of course, this has been present in certain genocides. But I don't know where the lines should be in terms of where, say, misogyny, sexist hierarchies, or homophobic hierarchies and policies, where that would become genocidal. I think I would raise the bar a little bit higher than the questioner seems to be. Doris, probably seems you have things to say about this.
I don't know if I have a well-formulated answer, but I'm really interested in this question, and also, Tracy, in your answer. And maybe it's time to, like, for me to try out my, like, 2 layers, you know what I mean, of the word genocide, because I think you're right. Like, if you think of the standard definition and usage, it's something different. But I think what the questioner is getting at is there's something maybe productive about thinking about what is destroyed if people can't live the life that they want to live. You know what I mean? Like, they might still be walking around in a society. They might not be facing, like, some kind of really obvious restrictions. But if someone's life in a way is not able to be like fulfilled in some basic way, like, again, maybe genocide isn't the right word, but to think about, how we think about prevention. It's very hard to talk about prevention because you don't know if you've prevented something because it didn't happen.
Yeah.
This is almost like the flip side of that. It's very hard to nail down destruction when the thing that's destroyed was something that never got a chance. You know what I mean? Like, to give like a simple example, maybe someone whose, life has been so impoverished that they might have been a great, scholar, but they never got a chance even to go to school, something like this. So I think the question does bring a really interesting point about what is destruction and what are the different forms that it can take, And if I could just refer again to Anna Haikova, who's working on this project of queer desire in the Holocaust. She's published a small book. Unfortunately, it's only in German, but maybe it'll come in English. But the title of the book is People Without History Are Dust. And like, when I first saw that title, I didn't know kind of what to think, but it's such a powerful concept to think about the way of like, why do people want to be remembered or recognized or seen or whatever? So I don't know. I think, yeah, again, it doesn't fit the genocide in the way that, we talk about it usually. But I think the questioner does raise a really interesting point to reflect on.
One thing that comes to my mind is that obviously genocide is a moral category, and I think that this is appropriate. But that's not tantamount to saying that all acts of violence and suppression that are morally blameworthy, that are deleterious, are genocidal. I mean, we can think of cases in history of mass enslavement where I don't think the logic of genocide is necessarily present, but they were still incredibly deleterious, incredibly immoral. And I think that cases of, in my view, cases of violence against gay people, and in some societies, this is very widespread, killings, corrective rapes, throwing acid on people, dismemberments, a wide range of violent behaviors that, these actions are oppressive and morally blameworthy. I'm not sure that they always are most appropriately put in the category of genocide, but that doesn't reduce their moral blameworthiness to me. I think, Andrew, you maybe had something to say.
Yeah, I mean, I always invite expansion of the genocide concept in some ways, because I think it's productive to push out some of its limitations. The question brings two things to mind. One is the National Inquiry for Murder and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, which was looking specifically at 2 LSGBTQIA individuals, in particular the loss of the erasure of two-spirited identities amongst Indigenous communities was seen as an aspect of the cultural genocide experienced by Indigenous nations in Canada, because of course the position of the two-spirited person within the community was very important. So I mean, it doesn't fit your question exactly, but it does show that in particular cultural contexts we could see this loss. I don't know if loss of rights is the right term, but the erasure of an LGBTQ identity would be destructive of the group, of in this case a cultural group. But I'm interested. I mean, I think I would encourage the question asker, if they're interested, to explore the ways in which groups are potentially defined out of existence, and what sort of meaningful relationships they lose as a group when they're subject to either having no public role because their identity is outlawed, or even in cases like in certain states where one can't get identity that is appropriate to one's what one feels one's gender to be. The gender diverse people cannot get their names and their identities recognized, which again has a way of defining them out of existence through more bureaucratic means. So that is certainly not traditional genocide studies research, but I think there could be some interesting, critical, productive discussion that comes out of that.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. I think that we've covered the questions. I apologize if I missed any. So I would like to thank the people in the audience for attending this panel, and certainly would like to thank the panelists for joining me today to discuss this topic. I think that this is a very important field, and I feel that it's contributed a lot to my scholarship and to me personally, actually, to start doing work in this field. And so I'm grateful to the panelists here for joining us, and in the case of a couple of you and your role of contributing to my scholarship in this area. So I hope you have a good evening, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.